Hey everybody, I hope you're doing good. Sorry I'm a little sniffly, because I'm always a little sniffly, but I hope you can live with that. This piece that I'm reading today is titled A Contribution to the Critique of Philo and Neo-Stalinism, Notes on Luciano Canfora and Domenico Losurdo. Christoph Jünke, born 1969, is a German Marxist. And his works include For an Anti-Capitalist Left on Europe, Text on the European Anti-Capitalist Left, published in 2004, Socialist Float Psalm, Leo Kofler, Life and Work, 1907 to 1995, published in 2007. I read a bit from that book on this channel. It was about Leo Kofler's thoughts on Stalinism in Eastern Europe. The Long Shadow of Stalinism, Socialism and Democracy Yesterday and Today, published in 2007. Wanderings Through the Red 20th Century, published in 2014. Leo Kofler's Philosophy of Practice. That was translated into English as Leo Kofler's Philosophy of Praxis, Western Marxism and Socialist Humanism, with 6 essays by Leo Kofler, published in English for the first time. That came out in 2022. He edited a book of Leo Kofler's on the critique of civil freedom, selected political philosophical texts of a Marxist loner, published in 2000. Using Leo Kofler as an example, Marxism in the 20th Century, he also edited. He edited Left-Wing Socialism in Germany, Beyond Social Democracy and Communism, ? He edited with Uwe Jacomite and Andreas Solper, Encounters with Leo Kofler, published in 2011. Marxist Criticism of Stalinism. He edited Marxist Criticism of Stalinism in the 20th Century, an anthology, published in 2017. Leo Kofler, Interventions, Short Writings on Marxist Theory and Practice. I don't know if I said this already, but Leo Kofler, Christoph Jünke, all these texts are in German. These are just translated. The titles are just translated into English here. I'm getting this from the German Wikipedia. The Bolsheviks and Democracy, published in 2017. These are essays. German Left and Identity, Political Correctness, published in 2023. Left-wing socialist intellectual Arno Kluna as a border crosser. The Treason Trial against Victor Agartz. Hope in Ruins, Victor Agartz, New Economic Democracy after 1945. Economic Democratic Reorganization Concepts after Fascism, using the example of Victor Agartz. In Stefan Berger's book, Trade Union History as a History of Memory. Critical Thinking Needs a Standard, in I. Bischel's edited volume, Critique of Critical Thinking. And Workers' Movement and National Question, in Sebastian Voigt, H. Zunker's edited volumes, Workers' Movement, Nation, Globalization, Inventory of an Old Debate. And he wrote an article for Junge Welt, Young World, the German newspaper of the old GDR. I believe that's where Junge Welt comes from. A Short History of the Left Socialist VSP from 1986 to 2000. So that's Christoph Jünke. Luciano Canfora. It says I looked him up before. My computer's telling me that I looked him up before, and I'm not probably really sure in reference to what. But there might have been, when I looked up looked up some things for an interview I read with a guy, a fascism scholar from Italy who is associated with Lotta Continua, the operaist guy. Can't remember his name. It's like Bruno something. It's like Bruno Bertelli or Bordelli or something like that. But Luciano Canfora, born in 1942, is an Italian classicist and historian. Born in Bari, Canfora obtained his first degree in Roman history in 1964 at Pisa University. Canfora has for some years been professor emeritus of classics at University of Bari. Luciano Canfora's specialty is ancient libraries, and his book, The Vanished Library, which is about the Library of Alexandria, has been translated into some 15 languages. Since 1975, Canfora has edited the periodical Quaderni di Storia. In 1998, he published a rebuttal of Elena Agorossi and Victor Zalovsky's work, Tagliati e Stalin, Il PCI e la politica estera staliniana negli archivi di Mosca, about criticism of Palmiro Tagliati and the Italian Communist Party. Luciano Canfora stood in the 1999 European Parliament election in Italy for the Party of Italian Communists. In 2004, Canfora published a history of democracy under the title La democrazia, storia di un'ideologia. I don't have a list of his works here. His books appear to include, seems like his big one is titled The Vanished World, A Wonder of the Ancient World, which was published in 1987, translated into English. That's the English text. And there's a bunch of other texts that he's written in Italian, of course. Domenico Losurdo, I think he was born in 1941 and died in 2018, and was an Italian historian, essayist, Marxist philosopher, and communist politician. I'll read the section from his Wikipedia on ideas and research. This is actually really long. His works include Aristocratic Rebel, Historical Revisionism, Liberalism, A Counter-History, Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend, Western Marxism, which I think is a new book that was just published. Yeah. Politically, it says, ideologically a Marxist-Leninist, Domenico Losurdo supported the interpretation that Mao Zedong gave the plurality to the class struggle by paying attention to the process of female emancipation in colonized peoples. Losurdo saw the Chinese economic reform as a new economic policy that, quote, did not undermine its socialist values, end quote. First close to the Italian Communist Party, then to the Communist Refoundation Party, and finally to the Party of Italian Communists, conflated in the Communist Party of Italy and in the Italian Communist Party, of which Losurdo was a member. Losurdo was also director of the Marx 21 Political Cultural Association. Throughout his life, he was strongly opposed to American interventionism and its foreign policies, imperialism, and NATO. Controversially, Losurdo contested the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo, I don't know, I think it's Xiao, I guess, Bo, accusing Liu of supporting Western colonialism. All right, I think that's enough to get us started. This was a working paper presented to the Historical Materialism Conference, London, November 2013. If I would have more time to speak, I would open my talk with a reminder of one of the last great controversies, maybe the last great controversy inside Western Marxism, before the decline of the socialist left in the 80s and 90s, with a reminder of the debate between E.P. Thompson and Perry Anderson on the poverty of theory, and Louis Althusser's theoretical Stalinism. In what follows, I am commencing this thread in an indirect manner, and you will see some remnants of the debate in the following. In my talk, I will wrestle not only with the legacy of 20th century Marxism and socialism, I will wrestle as well with the debates the international left has conducted in the first decade of the 21st century. I do this in 4 parts, and the first part is the mentioning of the intensifying transformation of liberal democracy. Section 1. The intensifying transformation of bourgeois democracy. The years of the first decade of the 21st century were years of intense discussions to renovate a viable new socialist left politically and intellectually, not only, but not at least, on conferences like this. The years of the first decade of the 21st century were also years of important social and political changes in the world. One of the main changes of this time was the rise and breakthrough of the so-called war against terror, a period in which democratic achievements and traditions are being called into question and scaled back by those who govern and rule. Principal fundamental values of the Enlightenment have been drastically shaken and undermined under the conditions of an intensified, globalized, and militarized neoliberalism. The process of disassembly of democratic principles and values is mainly a process that is organized and articulated from above, but it has also produced a certain weariness of democracy from below, a political apathy and abhorrence or dislike of democracy. Jacques Rancière even speaks of a, quote, hatred of democracy, end quote. This crisis-driven development could mean a new dawn for socialism, and the socialist left is requested today to formulate a socialist alternative to this evolution. Classical Marxists and socialists have always said that the bourgeois concept of freedom and democracy is a strictly limited concept, a theory of, quote, possessive individualism, end quote. But the other side of the left coin is that we are all told that socialism and freedom do not fit together. We are not only told so from neoliberals, neoconservatives, and all the others who point to the experiences with historical Stalinism and the really existing socialism of the 20th century. Socialism and democracy are mainly incompatible, and the Stalinist dissolution of democratic institutions, democratic values, and democratic movements have been a historical advancement, we are also told from prominent figures of the left, even in the last decade of left renovation. Before I give you 2 examples of this tendency, I have to depict, this is the second part of my paper, the political and theoretical consequences that we, in my view, have to draw from the legacy of the 20th century. Section 2. The 3 steps of freedom. Following the tradition of classical Marxism, the political freedom enforced through the bourgeois revolutions constitutes a real-world historic progress of mankind. Civic and individual legal liberties like the freedom of coalition and of assembly, the freedom of religion and opinion, the universal and equal suffrage, and all this constitutes something like the first world historical model of a real human freedom. The extension of these political liberties to the social realm, to a form of social democracy, enforced above all through the rebellious and fighting proletariat since the 19th century, constitutes something like the second world historical mode of freedom, the economic social freedom. But both modes of liberty are conceived here essentially in a negative way, as, quote, freedom from, end quote, as freedom from feudal chains, from individual dependency and political paternalism on the one hand, as freedom from material misery, from social oppression and disenfranchisement on the other. The socialist idea of liberty in classical terms, something like the world historical third stage of freedom, is indeed a positive freedom. Not, quote, freedom from is important here, but, quote, freedom to. Not, quote, freedom from is important here, but, quote, freedom to. Freedom to constitute the old humanistic idea of an all-embracing development of personality. An all-embracing development of personality. Indeed, and this is the crucial point, this third mode of freedom, the third stage of world historical freedom, is only accessible at the first two modes of world historical freedom. The political and the social liberty are not played off against each other, but inextricably fused on a higher level. Exactly the synthesis of social and political freedom failed to come to existence in the 20th century. The social democratic left restricted itself in the course of the 20th century to political liberties and made the working class a formally equal member of the bourgeois capitalist regime. The communist left, on the other hand, ensured, more or less, social liberties for the working class, exempted it from material uncertainty and pauperization, but only at the price of withdrawing the individual and political liberty from them. Thus, both main currents of 20th century socialist labor movement, the 20th century labor movement, displaced and, quote, forgot, end quote, the decisive third world historical mode of freedom, the old idea of emancipation and progress of the all-embracing individual, as well as collective unfolding of the human essential powers. In this theory of the three world historical stages of freedom, first formulated from the German-Austrian Marxist Leo Kofler, on whom I heavily draw here, 6 decades ago, we not only see the critique of bourgeois liberty connected with the critique of 20th century bureaucratic socialist liberty. We can also detect an actualization of the early bourgeois, radical humanist objectives in favor of the socialist movement. Every new attempt to build socialism, according to Leo Kofler, can gain majority and can be victorious only if it is able to fuse political with social liberties in a practical political way. Socialism turns out to be an all-embracing humanism. Socialism as the simple that is so difficult to achieve. With this formula of interpretation, we not only have one of the central lessons of the legacy of 20th century socialism, we also have the key to interpret contemporary discussions on the topic. So let me now come to my third part, to Luciano Canfora and Domenico Losurdo, two examples of prominent left-wing theoreticians which I want to identify as philo or Neo-Stalinists. And according to Wikipedia, obviously, when you hear the word Neo-Stalinism, you know what it means. But just wanted to see if there's anything special in the Wikipedia on Neo-Stalinism. Neo-Stalinism is the promotion of positive views of Joseph Stalin's role in history, the partial reestablishing of Stalin's policies on certain or all issues, and nostalgia for the Stalinist period. Neo-Stalinism overlaps significantly with Neo-Sovietism and Soviet nostalgia. Various definitions of the term have been given over the years. Neo-Stalinism is being actively promoted by Eurasianist currents in various post-Soviet states, and official rehabilitation of Stalin has occurred in Russia under Vladimir Putin. Eurasianist philosopher Alexander Dugin an influential neo-Stalinist ideologue in Russian elite circles, has praised Stalin as the, quote, greatest personality in Russian history, end quote, compared him to Ivan the Terrible, who established the Tsardom of Russia. Obviously, Domenico Losurdo and Luciano Canfora are not in the same world as Alexander Dugin. But anyway, back to the text. Section 3, Luciano Canfora and Domenico Losurdo. The first to mention here is Luciano Canfora, the Italian classicist and historian who has published in 2006 A History of Democracy, which was widely acclaimed on the left, but has caused an excessive debate in the German public. Canfora writes the history of democracy mainly as a history of an ideology, and translates the meaning of this ideology into the meaning of a bourgeois or liberal democracy. Canfora rightly demonstrates that this history of democracy has a lot of structural, undemocratic tendencies. At all times throughout history, there is a great deal of oligarchy in this triumphal procession of liberal democracy. But is that all to say? For progressives and Marxists, democracy was always more than that. For them, the history of democracy was mainly a struggle of the subaltern classes in the last 2 centuries of the modern working classes and other layers. Democracy is both a century-old form of political and social movements for freedom and a set of specific historical institutions that were culminating in the modern liberal democracy. But for Canfora, democracy is only an ideological and institutional means for bewildering the people and the subordinated classes. Canfora doesn't have a viable concept of democracy and writes a history not of class struggles from below, but of class struggles from above, right and left. Right and left. Democracy for him is not a conspiracy of the equals, but a conspiracy of the rulers and the elites. In Canfora, we don't find democracy as a powerful means of emancipation. We don't find defense of democratic values, needs, and forms. For Canfora, freedom and democracy are, quotation, quote, at last empty, hollow words, end quote. We don't learn the contested history of democracy, but we hear a lot of the cumulative abhorrence of liberal democracy, of a, quote, hatred of democracy, end quote. In the tradition of vulgar Marxism, Luciano Canfora advocates the idea of a social democracy in form of a principal refusal of democratic forms. Where Marxists see a dialectical triad of freedom, equality, and solidarity, Canfora sees only antagonistics. For Canfora, freedom and solidarity have to be neglected to propagate an equality in which some animals are more equal than others, ... It is therefore really no accident that the second part of the book, where Canfora deals with the 20th century, comprises a great apologia of historical Stalinism. He reproduces the whole program of the Stalinist logic, the whole program of Stalinist arguments, prejudices, and denunciations. For every historical turn of Stalin's political zigzags, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s, Canfora finds justifications in the sense of a philosophy of history. All his arguments in detail aren't new or especially original. All these arguments accompany the attempts from socialists of the 20th century to justify the post-revolutionary conditions and regime in the Soviet Union. And these apologias, like the one of Canfora's too, heavily draw on these two theses of Stalin's, quote, realism on the supposed end of the world's revolutionary process in the 20s, which is based on the Stalinist myth of, quote, socialism in one land, end quote. The logic of this argument, as you will know, goes this way. On the background of the supposed end of world revolutionary processes in the 1920s, The old social and political class struggles are substituted by a new political struggle of the two world camps of, quote, capitalism and, quote, socialism. And what counts in this clash of systems are not the present day democratic means, but the social aims of the future. The future aim who are incorporated in the socialist bureaucracy of the present. Here we have the antagonistic struggle between the two first models of world historical freedom, the bourgeois political freedom and the social freedom of really existing socialism. And in this struggle, the two modes of freedom are not fused on a higher level, but are played off against each other. The immanent heart of this worldview and its conception of transition to socialism is the concept of a ruthless development of the economic technical forces of production, in contrast to the social forces of workers and other citizens. The realm of freedom, according to this worldview, will come naturally and mechanistically through the development of the economic technical forces of production. In this technocratic view, the main guardian of progress is once again the socialist bureaucracy. And if means and aims become antagonistics, we have to choose the new bureaucracy as the incorporation and guardian of the main aim of social freedom, and we have to ignore the old humanistic idea of an all-embracing development of personality as a supposed idealistic claim. Even crimes are justified in this worldview. Isn't it the case, they tell us, that all bourgeois revolutions have used such crimes after all? The immanent heart of this bureaucratic worldview, therefore, is the comparison. More than this, the correspondence of the bourgeois and socialist revolutions. And the contemporary master of this left bourgeois logic is the second left-wing theoretician I want to mention here, the Italian philosopher and historian Domenico Losurdo. Already in the year 2000, Losurdo has published a little pamphlet on the communist movement between self-criticism and self-hatred called, quote, Escape from History, end quote, with a question mark. In this pamphlet, Losurdo equalized the crimes made by really existing bourgeois politicians with the crimes of really existing socialist politicians, mainly Stalin. Losurdo never tires here to compare Stalin with Roosevelt or Churchill and behave badly with a cynical nitpicking of these persons has killed more people, even asking hypocritically if the crimes of Bill Clinton are not more worse than that of Joseph Stalin. For Losurdo, Stalinism, quotation, quote, with all Stalin's horrors, bracket, exclamation point, end bracket, was, end bracket, a chapter of the emancipation process which defeated the Third Reich, end quote, and has given the impulse for fighting against colonialism, racism, and anti-Semitism. Losurdo admitted that we find dictatorship, terror, and crimes in the country of the October Revolution and inside the communist world movement. But for Losurdo, every registered crime was an integral part of what he terms the Third World War. For Domenico Losurdo, what's done is done, not as a product of the new socialist order, but as a remnant of the bourgeois past. A few years ago, Losurdo has now published a book. There's some translation problems here, I think, probably, or just typos. So if this sentence sounds weird, I'm sorry. A few years ago, Losurdo published a book on Stalin, which is not a historical work, but a kind of critique of ideology. A critique of ideology in a really Stalinist way of amalgamation. Khrushchev, I think that's how I don't know. I think this might have been fed through some kind of speech thing, I don't know. Khrushchev and Trotsky. Let me see if this, because I think it's spelled here Chruschtschow, which I'm assuming means Khrushchev. Yeah. Maybe that's how it's spelled in German. I don't know. Khrushchev and Trotsky, Churchill and Isaac Deutscher, the Congress of Cultural Freedom and the left radicals of the POUM, for whom they are all the same bourgeois critics of an emancipatory socialist regime which was and is justified in a worldwide civil war against the crimes of bourgeois society. From the Stalinist battler against the left and right opposition, to the battle against the kulaks and the Great Purges, from the Hitler-Stalin pact to Stalinist anti-Semitism, from the Chinese Cultural Revolution to Pol Pot, Losurdo always finds guilty not the culprits but Western liberalism and its Trojan horses on the left. All the crimes of the Stalinist left are necessary consequences of the state of emergency in the Third World Civil War. I can't go here in details, but this is not Karl Marx. This is Carl Schmitt on a lower level. In detail and on the whole, Losurdo's Stalin book is scientifically a joke, intellectually shattering, politically scandalous, and morally cheeky. Or cheek. Sorry, like I said, there's some weird shit here. Morally cheek. I don't know what that means. But in Germany, it is printed now in the second edition after only 1 year and without any major left outcry. Same here, brother. Well, maybe not his Stalin book. I feel like I don't hear about his Stalin book that much, but maybe if I was in shittier radical circles, I would be. Section 4. No socialism without, radical, democracy, I am now coming to my last point, the fourth of my paper. Stalinism, first of all, is a historical event, identified at the Soviet-Russian time under Stalin. But Stalinism is also a political theory and praxis, a specific form of political thinking and acting, which as such has no necessary connection with the historical event of Stalinism. But in actuality, most of the philo or Neo-Stalinists try to legitimate the historical Stalinism. In one way or another, they try to euphemize and whitewash the history. They defend the actors and the system. But Stalinism, as E.P. Thompson had already written in the 1950s, in his famous essay on socialist humanism, was it a mistake or an accident? Stalinism was and is an ideological system, a form of false consciousness, ideology, based not at least on a vulgar materialist reading of Marxist thinking. The Stalinist ideology is a constellation of partisan attitudes and false or partially false ideas. The Stalinist acts or writes in certain ways, not because he is a fool or a hypocrite, but because he is the prisoner of false ideas. For Thompson, and I think he is absolutely right on this, is not to suggest that Stalinism arose just because Stalin and Stalin's apologists had certain wrong ideas. Stalinism is the specific ideology of a revolutionary elite that, within a particular historical context, degenerated into a bureaucracy. The young Trotsky called it a kind of political substitutionism, a kind of structural anti-democratic thinking and acting. I'm going to say that this as a side note, this young Trotsky that's being referred to of Our Political Tasks or whatever, from the early 20th century, like 1903 or 1903, I believe, is when it was published, is a critique of Leninism, not just Stalinism, of Leninism. 30 years ago, in his controversial but famous masterpiece on the poverty of theory, E.P. Thompson writes, quote, "Of course, Stalinism as historical eventuation belongs to the past. Stalinism will not come back in that form, ... And yet, does it belong to the past? Does it belong to the past? For it was not only a particular historical eventuation, but also one of the ultimate disasters of the human mind and conscience, ... If we consider Stalinism in its second sense, as a set of institutional forms, practices, abstracted theories, and dominative attitudes, then the, quote, post-Stalinist generation, end quote, has not yet been born. Stalinism, in this sense, gave to us the agenda of the present, and its forms and modes, quote, weigh like an Alp, end quote, on the brains of the living. And the living, never mind which generation, need their combined strength to shift that Alp, end quote. E.P. Thompson. Today we are witnessing the intellectual revival of philo or Neo-Stalinism, which answers to the crisis-driven state of affairs in neoliberalism and neo-imperialism in a short-circuited manner of, quote, hatred of democracy, end quote. This philo or Neo-Stalinism is, materialistically speaking, the expression not only of the remnants of the past, it reflects more than this a shadow of the political future. Wherever we think of a transformation beyond capitalism, and wherever we try to make political steps in that direction, we are confronted with a political substitutionism as one of the main dangers of political avant-gardism in the sense of elitism. It was this likewise, quote, transhistorical, end quote, danger that has incorporated itself in classical ways in historical Stalinism. But socialism in the 21st century can only become hegemonic and capable of winning a majority of the population as a form of political autarky. Is that a word? Or is that a typo? I don't know. I don't know what that word's supposed to be. But socialism in the 21st century can only become hegemonic and capable of winning a majority of the population as a form of political autarky if the majority of population becomes self-acting in the broadest political and social sense. This can only come about insofar as the spirit of a universal radical democratic self-acting takes root in the heads of the people and in democratic institutions too, in organs of a truly socialist democracy, which are capable to satisfy and to ensure the radical democratic needs and values of the people. In the classical words of Perry Anderson in his famous essay on Antonio Gramsci, quote, in fact, the socialist revolution will only triumph in the West by a maximum expansion, not constriction, of proletarian (socialist) democracy. For its experience alone, in parties or councils, can enable the working class to learn the real limits of bourgeois democracy and equip it historically to surpass the limits of bourgeois democracy. End quote, Perry Anderson. This is socialism as the simple that is so difficult to achieve. And this is meant by the famous words of Rosa Luxemburg, written on the occasion of the Russian Revolution of 1917, quote, but socialist democracy is not something which begins only in the promised land after the foundations of socialist economy are created. Socialist democracy does not come as some sort of Christmas present for the worthy people who in the interim have loyally supported a handful of socialist dictators. Socialist democracy begins simultaneously with the beginnings of the destruction of class rule and the construction of socialism. It begins at the very moment of the seizure of power by the Socialist Party. End quote, Rosa Luxemburg. Written at the beginning of the 20th century, this was scarcely more than an act of prophecy. But today, nearly 100 years later, we can see these words as historically verified, and every left discussion that ignores this lesson and that falls back into the old patterns of Stalinist thinking is quintessentially regressive. Left-wing, quote, hatred of democracy, and the philo and neo-Stalinists are haters of democratic values and principles, of democratic traditions and institutions, of democratic movements and needs. Left-wing abhorrence of democracy is not only an analytically false, but even more, a politically dangerous impasse in our discussions to renovate a viable new socialist left, politically and intellectually. We cannot overcome the half measures of bourgeois political emancipation with the half measures of a form of emancipation we know from the days of really existing socialism. Every contemporary attempt to gloss over, to defend or justify, to reproduce the theory or the praxis of the historical Stalinism is morally reprehensible. More than this, is a political regression sui generis because it falls back in an authoritarian and substitutionist form of policy that can't help the contemporary crisis-ridden left. It was this authoritarian and substitutionist policy that brought the left into disrepute, and rightly so! Exclamation point. No renewed anti-capitalism without a renewed anti-Stalinism. Pointing to the critique of left-wing elitism as an integral danger of left-wing avant-gardism. No renewed historical materialism without discussing the likewise, quote, trans-historical, end quote, character of this elitist form of avant-gardism and the consequences for theoretical Marxism. So, for me, we are pressed to discuss the theme of a contemporary philo or Neo-Stalinism. These tendencies aren't yet articulated politically, but they're an identifiable intellectual current which finds a lot of attraction on the broader left. In Germany, for instance, Losurdo, Canfora, and others are left-wing bestsellers. Against this, we have to remember the great works of E.P. Thompson from the end of the 1970s. Quote, historians should know that freaks, if tolerated, and even flattered and fed, can show astonishing influence and longevity. After all, to any rational mind, the greater part of the history of ideas is a history of freaks. End quote. The end. Thank you for your attention. I think that this was probably like something that was kind of roughly transcribed from a verbal talk because it says like quote as opposed to just having a quotation mark. But this is a very good essay. I liked it. Or a very good talk. I liked it. Thank you for listening.